This week on Surfing the NASH Tsunami.
When I looked at epidemiological studies for fatty liver and NASH, one thing that's missing is really good quality prospective data that looks not only at fatty liver, but looks at non-alcoholic steatohepatitis.
We got really high value data. For example, some of the important data we found was that in certain subgroups, the prevalence of NAFLD is very, very high and higher than the 38% overall prevalence in the cohort.
At the end of the day, I think it shows that if you take your average middle-aged American coming for screening colonoscopy without any history of any liver disease that they know of, if you screen for NAFLD, you're going to find it in more than 1/3 of individuals, and then, NASH was present in 14%.
Every week, a global community of fatty liver disease stakeholders comes together to explore the most important challenges in diagnosing, treating, and developing medications for patients with fatty liver diseases. Join hepatology researcher and key opinion leader Dr. Stephen Harrison, liver wellness advocate Louise Campbell, pricing and forecasting guru Roger Green, and this week's guests, hepatology researchers and key opinion leaders Dr. Naim Alkhouri and Dr. Gawrieh, as they discuss the article our three key opinion leaders authored recently on prevalence of NAFLD and NASH in an asymptomatic middle-aged U.S. population, this week on the Surfing the NASH Tsunami podcast.
For everyone with an interest in NASH or more broadly fatty liver disease, Surf's Up. Season 2, Episode 25 of Surfing the NASH Tsunami starts now. Last week we wrapped up the 4th Global NASH Congress, and this week we welcome Stephen back for the first time in 5 weeks. Stephen, when we left you, your daughter had just chosen a university, making an expensive but family-supportive choice. Graduation season was coming into full swing. What's been new with you in the last 5 weeks we haven't seen you?
Well, first of all, I'm glad to be back. And I hear you guys did amazingly well without me, so that's good to know. You guys can rock it without me being around, so that's terrific. I have been focused on helping my daughter finish up her senior year, and I'm glad to say that is all kind of coming to an end with graduation set for next Saturday. And as you noted, she's accepted SMU as her college of choice and will be heading up there in the fall, and that's about it. My son finished up his sophomore year at Texas A&M in engineering, and he's home for the summer trying to get a job. That's kind of my update.
And an excellent one of this. Thanks for being with us. Naim, welcome back. I kind of feel like we didn't miss Stephen as much as we would have otherwise, because between you and Jorn and Mazen and Sunil, we had at least 2 or 3 high-quality people with us everywhere we went. How are you doing this week?
I'm good. How are you guys?
I think everybody's fine. Louise, how are you this morning? Welcome back.
I'm fine, thank you. Welcome back to everybody else, and Miss Stephen.
Silver-tongued devil that he is. I think that sounds right. I'd like to welcome Dr. Gawrieh, who has not been on the podcast with us previously, from Indiana University, an esteemed colleague of Naim and Stephen's, and a guy who's made a bunch of contributions in different areas and was part of the paper we're going to be talking about today. Samir, how are you today, sir?
I'm doing good, Roger. Thank you so much for having me. Very happy to be with this group.
We're delighted that you're able to join us. Every time someone new comes on, y'all wind up elevating everything we do. It's excellent. Do us a favor for us and for the audience. Take maybe 2 or 3 minutes and tell them a little bit about yourself, your background, academically, where you are now, what you do, what your interests are. And then at the end, one fact that we wouldn't know about you if you didn't tell us today.
Well, I'm a hepatologist at Indiana University. I did my training in Wisconsin and Minnesota. I did the transplant hepatology training at Mayo Clinic, and then worked at the Medical College of Wisconsin for about 10 years, where I directed the transplant program there. Then I moved to Indiana University, IU. My research has been focused on different aspects of fatty liver. As Naim mentioned earlier, that I developed artificial intelligence or machine learning-based systems to automatically assess the histology in NAFLD. That was one area of focus. But I also look at different other aspects of fatty liver, mainly non-alcoholic and also alcoholic, genetics, clinical prediction models, and therapeutics. I'm also active in randomized controlled trials for NASH. So that's my background. I also do some research in alcohol, co-directing a national network for alcoholic hepatitis research, and just staying busy with all this research. One thing that you may not know about me, if I didn't tell you, is that I am originally from Syria and been in this country for over 20 years. Very blessed, 3 boys and a wife. I'm trying to stay alive with this virtual learning. This has been my focus for the past year. We're almost there with this this academic year.
Well, congratulations for surviving 3 young boys, a weighty career, and a year of virtual learning would be enough to drive anybody to drink. Although I guess if you study alcohol hepatitis for a living, that might not be the place you choose to go.
I'm trying not to go there. Yeah.
Well, that's great, and thank you for that. Let's get started. Move on to today's icebreaker. Just the basic icebreaker. One good thing, personal or professional, that's happened in the last week in your life. Brave one, go first.
I guess it's been a busy few weeks for us here at Arizona Liver Health, but we're gearing up to start our phase 1 unit. So we're excited to be able to do phase 1 trials, and then we are starting a new site out of state. This will be the first one for us in Cleveland, Ohio, and we hope to get busy with clinical trials that will provide access to patients in Northeast Ohio for high-quality NASH trials. Personally, I think I'm trying to enjoy the last few days in Arizona where human beings can survive in a pleasant way before it gets too hot. So I had a nice weekend. I went to the JW Marriott Resort and spent a couple of days. It was very pleasant. Otherwise, just gearing up for the summer in Arizona.
Good luck with that.
Oh, I'll jump in next. I suppose for us, it's the fact that in my other role, the Excel, and with Bart's Health, that we're probably going to tick off 100,000 vaccinations performed at the Excel this week. So that's a big milestone. They keep rolling in, which is good to see.
All right. Well, I don't have anything as fancy as either of those. I would just say that personally, I survived Mother's Day, and I think I made all the right calls. I did all the things I was supposed to do. I made it through, I think, unscathed. And just a special shout out to moms out there. You don't get enough credit for all the hard work that you do and the contributions you make. Many of you work full time and also function as being a mother. I did connect with my mom. I took care of my wife, let her have the day to herself. And so I think it was a success. So again, special thanks to all the moms.
You really are silver-tongued, Stephen. That was really compelling and a great thing to note on this occasion. Samir, go ahead. What you got?
My main focus for the past week had been Mother's Day. We've made it a special day for my wife, me and the boys, and we survived it. And we had a good Mother's Day. My wife was happy about the boys showing the love and care. So that was the main thing for the family over the past week. Academically, everything is just busy at high steam. Nothing really out of the usual academically.
So I think I'll stay with that theme because most of the most interesting things happening both personally and professionally I can't quite talk about yet either because I'm not allowed or because I don't want to jinx them. But we decided to come down to Texas for Mother's Day. We flew in on Saturday so that my wife could spend Mother's Day with our son and our granddaughter. And it was a great day. Our granddaughter gets older and more interesting and more mature by the day. And my wife had the best day she possibly could have had. So that was a good thing. I agree with Stephen. I think mothering is one of the tough and really under-recognized jobs in the world. At one point in my life, I spent 7 years as a single custody joint parent, and that gave me respect for mothers and everything they do that I don't think I'd ever realized before that. With that, why don't we go on to the episode? This episode is about a paper that had 10 co-authors, 3 of whom are on the podcast with us today, to experimentally derive estimates of the U.S. NAFLD and NASH populations, which is really an exciting thing. When I came into this disease in 2019 and was asked to do a commercial assessment for talk at NASH-TAG, the first thing that struck me was the numbers were all over the place. And none of them were well defended enough for me to understand why one was right and the other was wrong. So having a study that experimentally derives numbers where they make sense mathematically and you can track exactly how the authors got there, I think will have huge implications for commercial forecast, public policy, medical priorities, you name it. And I'm sure that you folks who did the paper thought of a few more that we haven't thought of yet. With that, let me turn this talk over to Stephen and to Naim and to Samir, who will walk us through their paper. Take maybe 7 or 10 minutes and start with why you did the project and what you set out to do, and then talk a little bit about what we learned and what's in it. Stephen, I think you go first. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Roger. And again, special thanks to Naim and Samir for helping me get this project across the finish line. I could not have done it without them, and they don't ever get the credit that they deserve. So I think, again, I hold them in high esteem in this regard. You hit on it a little bit in your initial opening statement. When I looked at epidemiological studies for fatty liver and NASH, one thing that's missing is really good quality prospective data that looks not only at fatty liver, but looks at non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. And really, while we are developing non-invasive tests for that, the gold standard remains liver biopsy. So if you look at the literature and you look for prospective liver biopsy-based trials to understand the prevalence of both NAFLD and NASH, you're struck by the fact that there really aren't any. There was the one study that I published back in 2011 in Gastro, which was very similar to the one we're going to talk about today. It was a much smaller study, and it used ultrasound alone to guide whether or not we did liver biopsies, but it was limited by the number of NASH patients that were diagnosed and the number of non-invasive tests that were done. So we wanted to reproduce that study, but do it on a much grander scale. And the military really is optimal for doing that sort of prospective trial. The patients are generally very compliant. They span the spectrum, both in age, gender, and ethnicity, and they're responsible. So they want to complete what they start out to do. And so we embarked on this prospective trial. So the way we decided to do it was we had these very large colon cancer screening classes in our gastroenterology clinic at Brooke Army Medical Center, where patients would be referred by primary care for a routine colonoscopy, not a colonoscopy done because they were bleeding or had belly pain or change in stools, but just because they reached the age at which screening would be necessary as part of routine health maintenance. And so when they came in, we would teach them about colonoscopy. We'd show them a video of a colonoscopy, just the basics of what a colonoscope looked like and what preps were like and what to expect the day they came in. And then we consented them for the procedure and gave them their prep and then booked them for their follow-up appointment. At the end of that, I got up in front of the class and I said, how would you like to know your liver health? You're here for your colon health. I'm giving you an opportunity to take part in a study to learn your liver health. There's a couple caveats. You can't be in the study if you've had known history of liver disease, to include fatty liver. You have to drink under the requisite amount of alcohol. So, the classic definition, 3 drinks a day, 21 drinks a week for a man, 2 drinks a day, 14 drinks a week for a woman. If you drank less than that, you're good. More than that, you're excluded. And you couldn't be on medications that caused fatty liver. Now, if you met all those criteria, you were given a consent form and the study was explained to you. And the study went something like this. Once you signed consent, we sent you down for a blood test to assess your liver function, just basic labs. And then we did a FibroScan with CAP, controlled attenuation parameter. And then we sent you for an MRI. And that MRI, we did MR proton density fat fraction. We did multiparametric MR using the corrected T1 technique. And then we did MR elastography. And patients that had predetermined abnormal imaging parameters were offered a liver biopsy to evaluate for NASH. These biopsies were read in a blinded fashion with consensus by 2 expert hepatopathologists. And the prevalence of NAFLD was determined by having an MRI-PDFF of greater than 5%, or when the PDFF and biopsy data were available, it was determined by histologic diagnosis of fatty liver, and the prevalence of NASH was defined by biopsy. So that was the way we went about the study. Sometimes people wonder, is the Department of Defense the VA? And I would say it's a very different patient population. In the Department of Defense, patients are treated from the cradle to grave. So you're born there and oftentimes you die there. And so we have a wide spectrum of age from, 18 all the way up into the latter years. Again, these are people presenting for colon cancer screening. So we're not going to be screening the very old, a middle group of people that we concentrated on. In fact, the mean age was 56 years of age. But I do think it gives us a really good snapshot of the true prevalence of fatty liver using the gold standard MRI-PDFF. And because we did biopsies prospectively, I think it gives us a nice snapshot of the prevalence and severity of NASH. Now, the usual caveats exist. It is a single-centered trial at a tertiary care center centered in Texas. So you can extrapolate that this isn't a global prevalence study. But the caveat is that it's liver biopsy based. And there aren't too many other studies studies where liver biopsy is utilized to determine prospectively the prevalence of NASH. So with that, I'm going to just pause for a minute and let my co-authors kind of talk briefly about the results of the trial, and then we can talk about some of the nuances of the data.
Happy to do so. First, I really would like to thank Stephen for the opportunity to be part of this magnificent and important effort. I really enjoyed the scientific adventure, and the group came to produce an important piece of medical knowledge that will have public health implications. So the big findings were that in all patients, 38% had fatty liver, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and then 14% had biopsy-proven NASH. Looking at any fibrosis, 6% had any fibrosis, and about 1.5% had advanced fibrosis, defined as a bridging fibrosis based on biopsy. Now, these are the high-level findings of the study, but there were many other layers of important findings. The cohort was enriched by different subpopulations, and because the approach was systematic, using state-of-the-art imaging modalities, coupled with predetermined criteria for offering biopsy that was centrally read, we got really high-value data. For example, some of the important data we found was that in certain subgroups, the prevalence of NAFLD is very, very high and higher than the 38% overall prevalence in the cohort. So if you look at patients who had diabetes, 70% of them had NAFLD. That's quite a high rate. And of diabetics, 35% who agreed to have a biopsy had NASH. This is a very important finding, which has screening implications for NAFLD and NASH in this high-risk, high-prevalence population. If you look at Hispanics, the prevalence of NAFLD was 55%, and if you look at NASH, Hispanics had 25% prevalence of NASH. Now, when a patient had compounded risk factors, the prevalence of both NAFLD and NASH increased. So these are the high-level findings of the study. Obviously, in the current era of non-invasive testing, fibroscans, and MRI, the study seriously raises the question of should we embark on a systemic effort to look for clinically significant NAFLD, which means NASH or NAFLD with fibrosis in certain high-risk populations.
I also want to thank Stephen and the team in San Antonio for conducting this rigorous study. I think this is as good as it will ever get in terms of determining the prevalence of NASH, because NASH is a histologic diagnosis and it's really hard to do these biopsy studies. Most of the previous estimates were based on liver enzymes such as ALT elevation, liver ultrasound, which has several limitations, both sensitivity and specificity. We have some data now with FibroScan, but it's not as accurate as MRI-PDFF to quantify liver fat. So I think this is a landmark paper. As Samer said, this was kind of middle-aged Americans. It's not, a representative of the entire United States adult population. So the median age was 56. We had maybe overrepresentation of obesity. 52% were obese. Mean BMI was around 30 kilogram per meter square. At the end of the day, I think this shows that if you take your average middle-aged American coming for screening colonoscopy without any history of any liver disease that they know of, if you screen for NAFLD, you're going to find it in more than 1/3 of individuals, and then, NASH was present in 14%. As Samer said, if you look at diabetics, it was almost double the rates for both NAFLD and NASH. Hispanics had higher rates. As we've known all along, African Americans had lower rates, which is a good thing. But if you start compiling these risk factors, so if you take Latino, man with type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, obesity, you're talking about rates as high as 80 to 90% having NAFLD, and then NASH in the 35 to potentially 50%. So we're getting to a point with all these data that we need to think about a systematic way to screen for NAFLD and determine its severity in high-risk groups. And I think this is one of the biggest unmet needs in the field, that we really don't have any guidance who should be screened for NAFLD. We are updating the AASLD guidance, and hopefully we will have concrete recommendations who should be screened. I like the EASL guidelines now that they recommend patients with type 2 diabetes be screened for NAFLD with liver enzymes and ultrasound. We have some cost-effectiveness data showing that if you actually take middle-aged diabetics, that this is cost-effective, and there are several ways to do the screening. These data shows not only that NAFLD is very common, but that that NASH is actually more common than what we thought previously. Again, diabetics, Hispanics, combination of risk factors definitely have very good chance of having a significant disease, what we call fibrotic NASH. And these are the patients that will qualify for pharmacologic treatments once they become approved in the next couple of years. So in my mind, this is the time to start a large screening program and identify these patients so we can prevent progression to cirrhosis. I think one of the good findings in the study was that we didn't find any patients with cirrhosis, but I think this has to do, again, with the fact that these patients had no known history of any liver disease. We excluded anyone with known elevation in liver enzymes. They're completely asymptomatic from the liver standpoint. And we have data from previous studies showing that potentially up to 1 to 2% of the adult population of the United States may be at risk for NASH cirrhosis. So this is a big percentage when you're talking about end organ damage.
Well, I just wanted to chime in on a follow-up. So I think maybe some additional data relative to the study is the numbers of people that were enrolled. So 835 signed consent, 664 patients really comprised the data set from which MRIs were done and liver biopsies were performed if warranted. So the 664 number is the denominator from which we derived the prevalence of fatty liver. Ultimately, around 99 patients were diagnosed with NASH. A couple other interesting tidbits that I think Naim hit on a little bit, but I just want to foot stomp. 35% of these patients had F2 or F3 fibrosis. As mentioned, there was no cirrhotics, but remember, these people came in thinking their livers were normal. They didn't have any history of liver disease. They weren't concerned about their livers being sick. They were interested in finding out about their liver health, but they weren't coming in with any preconceived ideas that they had a liver problem.
Just to clarify that number before we go on, that's 35% of the 14%?
That's correct. It's 5.7% if my memory serves me correct, had F2 or F3 disease. So if you look at this from a global perspective, what we quote when the three of us write papers on fatty liver is 3 to 5% of the population has NASH. Well, that may be true for the overall population, although I'm a bit skeptical that that's an underestimation. But at least in the people that we generally see in clinic, this middle-aged cohort of patients, again, the mean age 56, the prevalence is much higher, around 14%. Again, the alarming thing is that those with F2 or F3 disease, 5.8, 5.7, 5.9%, somewhere in there. Now, I have to caveat this a minute. So I went back and pulled up the paper we published in 2011. Chris Williams was a fellow of mine at the time. He was the first author on that paper. The prevalence in that cohort, there were 328 patients, and that study was done from January 2007 to March 2010. 328 patients enrolled. The prevalence of NASH, again by biopsy, at that point was 12.2%. The prevalence of F2 to F3 disease was 2.7%. Fast forward now 8 to 10 years to the current study we're talking about today, NASH prevalence 14%. So it's gone from 12.2 to 14. Same population of patients, exactly the same. I mean, same center, same colon cancer screening group. But maybe the more alarming feature is the rise in the moderate to advanced fibrotic patient group. So those with F2 or F3. 2.7% in the first paper, 5.8, 5.9% in the second paper. So a huge increase in those patients diagnosed with underlying F2 or F3 disease. So yeah, a little bit of an increase in overall prevalence, but more of a disparate increase, if you will, in those with NASH and what I call at-risk NASH, those with NASH with at least F2 disease. That's a striking finding. The other thing I would say that's interesting from the trial is we had 130 African Americans in the study. So I would challenge somebody to go look in the literature on the prevalence and severity of NASH amongst African Americans. You won't find a cohort with 130 African Americans, at least to my knowledge, that's been published. And then add in the fact that it was prospective. And what we found there is what has been previously noted. So it's really just a foot stomp of what's been presented before, but with prospectively obtained data in a decent sized number of patients. And the prevalence of NASH is 5%. That's just exceedingly low relative to Hispanics, Caucasians, and Asians. So, there were some good data points gleaned from that population as well. So, Roger, Louise, what do you guys think?
I thought it was an excellent study, and I thought some of the figures are actually really quite impressive there. Particularly, you've all commented on the fact that there were no cirrhotic patients found. So I think the opportunity for me to turn around and look at their health now going going forward as to what did you put in to try and help these guys not become cirrhotic? Was there more dietetics? Was there more information? Was it used as an ongoing step to look after their liver health, to prevent? Because that's a good cohort. It's a very good size. And if you can prevent all of those people becoming cirrhotic, that's, for me, is the wellness aspect. Somebody gets an opportunity to turn that round. Did that get done afterwards, or were they sent back to their primary care physicians?
Obviously, the results were communicated with the patient, and those that had at-risk NASH were counseled on lifestyle modification, and then also the consideration to participate in clinical trials. And then those that had less disease severity were, again, counseled on lifestyle modification. As far as follow-up, there was no specific protocol extension to follow these people prospectively. Having said that, there was a sister study done in these patients where those patients that went to liver biopsy also went on to have coronary calcium CT scans done, as well as full echocardiograms, and I believe there is a cohort of those patients that are being followed prospectively. In addition, we are in the middle of going back and trying to get a protocol in place to evaluate the electronic medical record of the 664 patients that underwent MRIs to see, over time, if the MRI or if there's any clinical data that could predict outcomes. So as I was mentioning, the trial started in 2015, actually in August of 2015. So now it's May of 2021. There is some patients that are now almost 6 years into, or 6 years since they had their original scan. So it would be interesting now to go back and see if the baseline multiparametric CT1 score, the baseline MR elastography score, baseline ALT, AST, PDFF, diabetics, non-diabetics, if any of that could predict outcomes, whether they be cardiovascular, hepatic, or otherwise, cancer, kidney disease, any of those sorts of things. So that's currently in the works. We're going to see if we can get that done this year and hopefully report that data in short order.
Fantastic. The other thing I noted was you commented on the Hispanic population. And I know that the numbers in the Native American, Alaskan, Native Hawaiian, and the Pacific Islanders was quite small, but they too showed what we expect, a very high incidence. I think it was 25 and 22%. And obviously, I follow Aboriginal health and South Pacific Islanders from my Australian side a little bit. And it is a worrying level of liver disease or potential, even with small numbers. And where that takes us in places like some of these islands and Native Americans and Alaskans into managing and screening those populations.
So, Louise, you've educated me over time to take a look at American Hispanic numbers as kind of a marker for what those numbers might be. Not that the populations are identical, but they have similar traits. So I wasn't surprised when I saw those numbers for that portion of the cohort. It makes complete sense that no matter where in the world you go, if you've got populations at certain levels of economic status who eat certain kinds of diets, they're likely to have repeater problems unless there's something really unique in the gene pool. So I thought of you immediately and looked at that, and then I said, well, gee, that is kind of what I would have expected.
You got it, Roger. I totally agree. In addition to cultural and dietary differences between different subgroups, the genetic differences have been well studied in these different ethnic and racial groups. So Hispanics are known to have higher prevalence of the risk variant of the most powerful genetic influencer in NAFLD and liver disease, the gene PNPLA3. So Hispanics have the highest frequency of the risk variant. And African Americans actually have the lowest prevalence of that variant, whereas Asians and whites have frequency of that risk variant in the middle. So our data support what we already know about the frequency distribution of the risk variant for the PNPLA3. Another important finding of the study, I thought, was that the majority of patients, 74% of the patients, actually had normal ALT. This is a test that is commonly used in primary care and even GI practices to say, well, this patient has significant NAFLD or not. Now, we and others have reported that ALT level offers false reassurance. It really has poor sensitivity for detecting clinically significant NAFLD or fibrosing NASH. And that was the case in this study too. 74% of the cohort had normal ALT. Now, how does that factor in within the clinical management? I think what Stephen and Naim highlighted is that, we really have to take a different approach approach to risk assessment and stratification in the clinic. And maybe the new guidelines will help also advance this thought that with the availability of non-invasive testing, maybe we should look more thoroughly using these more useful methods than ALT for identifying who is really at risk NASH, who would require early intervention. Now, the approach followed in the study using state-of-the-art imaging, predetermined cutoffs as to who to offer a biopsy to, yielded another important finding. Now, when you find NASH in these patients, the vast majority, 80 to 85%, actually have what we call NAFLD activity score of 4 or more. These are the patients that you actually prioritize for treatment to prevent progression of NASH. So that was another important finding, that when you follow up on this protocol, you biopsy patients at risk, you find high prevalence NASH. It is the NASH that requires intervention. And this is a prime time for that because there is a whole slew of activity in the field to find therapeutic agents that would hold or improve NASH.
When you did the study with the excluded groups, which are the usual suspects, alcohol, those on methotrexate and any of the medication, did you consider to include them all and then subcategorize them in the groups? Because the real world population may well be on methotrexate and tamoxifen. They may well drink more than 21 units. So by selecting purely the NAFLD, and I completely understand why you guys did that, but actually looking at a real world population and bringing it down to the pure NAFLD population, because I can just imagine how many were in that population of methotrexate guys who would have had significant liver fat and maybe more significant fibrosis to have that opportunity to learn.
Yeah, we thought about that early on when we were designing the trial, but I think at the end of the day, we wanted to keep it as pure as we could relative to new diagnoses of NASH to really get at the true prevalence of this disease in our patient population. And also, we were a little bit resource constrained, Louise, as far as coordinator support and resources to do the trial. While it is a tertiary care center where tons of research is being conducted, the primary mission of Brooke Army Medical Center is to take care of our wounded warriors and our retiree population. And so the MRI scanners, for instance, are there for clinical care. And so we can't use all the scan time for research. So it was a little bit of a give and take with the IRB as far as what we were going to be allowed to do and what the radiologists were going to allow us to do and how much of their time they would spend reading the data. We also had to send the multi-parametric MRIs to Prospective in Oxford, and there was a cost associated. Well, it wasn't a cost because they performed those scans in kind, but there was a limit to the number of scans we could send them. Ultimately, we also received support from EchoSense to help do the study and the analysis, and they were very, very helpful. But again, there was some limits around what that would look like. So we wanted to be as focused as we could to get as much data as we could from a representative NAFLD population. One thing we were able to do that we didn't do in the first study published in Gastro in 2011 is in the first trial, we didn't get any blood work on the quote unquote normals. This time we did, so that we would have a comparison of normal to abnormal, which I thought was very helpful. In fact, I think that made the paper even that much better. One thing we haven't talked about, and this is the topic of a forthcoming paper from the same data set, is what happened with all the non-invasives, the multi-parametric MRI, the CT1, the FibroScan, the CAP. How did all that correlate with histopathology, with fibrosis? And we didn't have enough space to write about all that in this initial publication, but I can tell you that's a publication that we're anxious to get out, and it'll be a companion paper to this one.
And one point I want to make also is the fact that we diagnosed NAFLD in 244 patients based on the MRI-PDFF being more than 5%, but not every patient agreed to a liver biopsy. So we only had biopsies in 192, 52 patients declined, and the same rate of NASH that we're diagnosing in patients with NAFLD, I think the overall prevalence of NASH in the population would have been higher had we had biopsies on everyone. So we diagnosed NASH only in patients that agreed to the biopsy. I think we would be probably more like in the 17-18% range had we biopsied every patient in the study. So I think this is very alarming, and you're seeing rates of NASH maybe 3 times higher than previously reported. We always think of, okay, NAFLD is very common, but it's only a small percentage that have the aggressive form of NASH, but this study shows that it's really not a small percentage. It's, about 1/3 of people with NAFLD. And again, these are people without any known liver disease. So I think this has big implications for the entire, NAFLD-NASH market, whether it's diagnostics or therapeutics. I don't know, Roger, what do you think in terms of therapeutics with these percentages of people with actually significant disease that may require medications?
Well, first of all, let me go back and play with the numbers a little bit. Stephen described what you're seeking as pure prevalence. I would call it primary prevalence, because total prevalence is going to include people that you looked at, but also the methotrexate candidates that Louise mentioned, folks who have baffled, right, who drink a little more than the 2 or 3 drink limit, but where you couldn't define it as a purely alcoholic disease. So, Naim, I think, and when you add that to your comment, you might be up in the range of 20% by the time you're done, really, that have NASH. The first time I ever looked at these numbers, I did a whole bunch of my own kind of secondary stuff using publicly available databases, put them together and guessed that the NASH percentage would be 10 to 12. And then I looked at the paper that was widely cited that said 3 to 5. And I think, Stephen, if I remember, I actually made a comment in 19 in front of all those people that I was going to use that number, but somehow I thought it was really low. I listened to this and it makes me feel worse for the patient population, but better in some ways for the consistency of the data, in that I said 3 to 5 didn't feel right to me in the first place. This feels closer to right. Naim, so then to go to your question, I think it changes the dynamic of how people think about demand. That if you believe that you have a relatively small population and that you're not going to treat until later stage, that puts a certain amount of pressure on price to revenue, which is you have fewer patients, you think you need to make X return, therefore you price higher. At least that's what tends to happen in pharmaceuticals in the States. That doesn't play real well in the rest of the world, but it does here. If you have more patients, then you might actually think about pricing lower because of the patient pool. The other point that's really striking to me, Stephen, I was playing with the numbers that you had. So you had 2.7% was NASH in the first study, 5.8 or 5.7 in the second study. People take a look and say, gee, that's 3%, but no, really isn't. It's really 140% increase in the number of patients who are exposed, which is a huge increase in exposed patients.
Roger, this is NASH with F2 or higher.
That's exactly, by exposed, we mean immediately in need of treatment. So you've increased that pool even more than, well, as I say, you go from 2.7 to 5.9. That's 130 or something like that percent increase in the number of patients that need to be treated.
And now that you have 2 time points, you can begin to map what that would look like over time. So if you go from January 7 to March 2010 as one variable, so basically up to 2010, you fast forward to 2018. So 8 years, you see that degree of increase. What are the next 8 years? When we look at this in 2026, what's that number going to be like? If that trend line continues, which essentially we can blame COVID for, again, worsening obesity, worsening diabetes, increased sedentary lifestyle. That's been going on for 15 months. Around the world, it's still a major issue. I suspect that trend line is going to continue. So it goes from 2.7 to 5.9 in 8 years. Are we going to go from 5.9 to 9, 8, 9, 10% of advanced NASH in 2026? You can begin to speculate that may happen.
So, Stephen, I think it's less likely to be a linear. I'm not sure exactly how to be different, but probably not linear. It might be more than that. It might be less than that. The interesting question to me is to look at the endangered populations. If 70% of your patients have NAFLD right now in a community, and pardon me for using an only here, some here, only 30% of those turn out to have NASH right now, then you have a pool of 40% of patients who, under the situation that Stephen's described, which is what's happened, could get a lot worse in a hurry. And even 30 is pretty well epidemic, but you get higher than that, and you've got populations that have really a pandemic level risk. So the communities that are less likely to be affected or that came through the COVID crisis relatively intact may not be as affected, Stephen, but the communities that were endangered in the first place is going to get a lot worse. And there, I think we really need to jump on it.
Yeah. I mean, I absolutely agree. I just think when you have 2 time points like this, you can begin to, I don't want to just sit here and talk about the data today. I want to talk about where we're likely to go if we don't get after this and try to make a big fat dent in fatty liver disease, but also in the comorbidities that are linked to fatty liver. And when you look at what we've just come through and what we continue to live through, it doesn't appear that we're flattening the curve on obesity and diabetes. So almost assuredly, we're not flattening flattening the curve on fatty liver. And my guess is we're not flattening the curve on NASH with advanced fibrosis either.
So let me go to baffled, right? Because one of the things we haven't flattened the curve on is alcohol. Alcohol sales in the U.S. were up 54% in the first 6 months of the pandemic. No reason to think they've gone down from there. So again, the difference between primary prevalence, which is what you were looking at, and pure prevalence, which is everybody, those numbers are going to get worse.
Can I just ask, you've got your 2 time points there. Was there an increase in prevalence within the Hispanic population, or was that fairly stable? Were you able to identify a population at increasing risk?
Yeah, that's a great question, Louise. No, I don't have the original paper pulled up and broken down based on ethnicity, so I can't speak to that. My recollection, it was pretty close.
Stephen, can I make a comment on that without even seeing the data? So, Louise, the risk you're going to run with that number is you're only going to have 60, 70 Hispanic patients in the first cohort. The variability around those patients will be so great that it will drown the effect. If you've got a plus minus 11 on a population, and we think a 3-point or 5-point shift would be a big shift, we're just not going to see it.
But thank you, Louise, for asking that question, because what we've shown in the current study is that 55 of middle-aged Hispanics have NAFLD and 24% have NASH. So in my mind, if you're a 50-year-old Hispanic without any other risk factors, you should be screened for NAFLD. I think that by itself is enough. If you have type 2 diabetes without looking at any other clinical variables, you should be screened for NAFLD. I mean, we've done it in hepatology and other diseases like chronic hepatitis B, where we screen all Asian Americans for hepatitis B in certain communities. And I really don't see a reason why we shouldn't say, hey, if you're 50-year-old Hispanic, you need your colonoscopy, but you also need a non-invasive test to screen you for NAFLD. And we don't need to look at your liver enzymes. We don't need to look at your entire past medical history, just the fact that you are Hispanic, because unfortunately the burden of disease is definitely higher in this ethnicity. If we can get that message based on this paper, I think this would be very important for these communities.
That's exactly the sort of point that I was trying to look at, because yes, we enrich hepatitis B populations from Africa. We screen a lot earlier and different parameters. So any identification of at-risk groups with really high prevalence is excellent work.
Hey, Louise, I was able to pull up the abstract from the Williams paper. So in the abstract, it's listed Hispanics NAFLD 58%. That's using right upper quadrant ultrasound, not MRI-PDFF. It's close, 58% in the first paper, 55% in the current paper using MRI-PDFF for NAFLD prevalence in Latino Hispanics. The prevalence of NASH by biopsy was right at 20% in the first paper, 24% in this paper, with a caveat that Roger mentioned. There was only 40 NASH patients overall in the first paper. So the numbers get a little small, but the trend on NASH prevalence increasing is holding true for that population as well.
And to go to Naim's point, those are big stinking numbers. You don't need a lot of support from sophisticated statistics to say this is an issue that needs to get jumped on in its own right. I couldn't agree more with that. And Louise, for that reason, I think you didn't need the data to prove the point to your question, right? You're absolutely right.
Speaking of this, my first patient for the afternoon showed up with decompensated NASH cirrhosis. This is a missed opportunity, so let me go take care of him. But thank you guys so much for having me. This was delightful.
Thanks for joining us today. See you soon. So, Samir and Stephen, let me ask you the question I was going to ask all three of you. What was the biggest surprise to you in this data as you started to bring it in and analyze it?
I think there was lots of surprises, quite frankly, but the biggest surprise to me was the degree of moderate to severe NASH. So the paper I just pulled up, 5.9% of the general population having F2 or F3 fibrosis. And before you stop and say, well, gee whiz, that may or may not be a big number to me, remember, these people all thought they had completely normal livers. None of them walked in thinking they had a liver problem. But yet, 6% essentially of my population of patients I saw at Brooke Army, mean age 56, are walking around with NASH and moderate to severe liver disease. That's mind-boggling when you stop and think about the sheer numbers of people that are walking around thinking nothing is wrong with their liver, but yet they continue to eat tortillas, potatoes, pasta, chips, soda, all the things that drive lipotoxic fat. It's sobering, no pun intended there, when you think about those numbers on a global scale, not just on a United States population level. The one thing I wish we would have done that I've learned since we did the trial, that I've become a big advocate for, is really getting after defining the amount of omega-6 to omega-3 ratios that our patients are taking in. Because one thing I've learned with the pathogenesis of this disease is omega-6s, this is what vegetable oil and things of that nature, drive upregulation of the arachidonic acid cascade, which ultimately drives inflammatory mediators in NASH, which result in activation of stellate cells. And we're not ingesting enough omega-3s. And there were some recent guidelines on cardiovascular risk looking at omega-6 to omega-3 ratios. We actually need to flip the ratio in the United States. And the same thing could be said for India, for instance, where there's a higher prevalence of lean NASH. And there, they don't eat a lot of meat, so they're relatively choline deficient. Well, that's how we define NASH in a mouse model, is choline deficient animals that are fed high fat, high fructose, high cholesterol diets. So the Indian population eats a lot of rice, they use a lot of vegetable oil in their cooking, and again, choline deficient. So they're high omega-6, low omega-3s with choline deficiency, again, driving that phenotype of NASH. So wish we would have collected that data. We didn't do it, but it is what it is. But Samer, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what surprised you.
Yeah, I like the word you used, Stephen. Sobering were the findings, that's for sure. It's really a monumental challenge to deal with this epidemic. You know, I'm very happy to see the uptick of clinical trials we're all involved into to try to find effective and safe treatment for NASH. But really, the task is monumental and urgent, especially when you see high prevalence of NASH, fibrosing NASH, active NASH that is at risk for progression. It just makes the task of finding effective and safe therapeutics more urgent. And then the other point is the burden of clinically significant disease in certain populations, as we discussed, the diabetics, the Hispanics. Those are really sobering findings to me.
Thanks, both of you. Louise, you have anything you want to add?
No, the only thing that I was looking at is we know that a lot more gastric complaints with the diets that we have nowadays, and maybe we should be routinely fibroscanning and doing non-invasive in all endoscopy locations because they're fasted naturally to come in for these tests. I think there's been another study on the use of fibroscanning in endoscopy where I think 60% of the population with going for upper GIs who thought they had normal livers actually had fatty liver disease, but I can't remember the author. So I think if we're going to look for areas where we can coordinate care, reduce the number of tests, and actually identify the biggest at-risk populations, then maybe path of least resistance is somewhere like endoscopy. While people are waiting, they can have as many serial tests as possible. But it's just opportunities that evidence like this, again, quantifies about how big the population is. And yet we're still not routinely screening in large percentages of populations. And yet the cost, both to society and healthcare and life, is so large. We will wake up and smell the coffee, I'm sure.
With all apologies, because I don't have the luxury of being able to look for data while I've got this podcast up on my screen. So I don't recall exactly where this number came from, but I looked at a few things that suggested, apropos of the median age, the average age of 56 in this population, and where you chopped off the upper limit, that peak NASH NAFLD age is 65 to 74. That tends to be maybe 40% higher, 40% higher than the age you would find in a 45 to 64 cohort. So if you think of where the older population is likely to land, the folks that you lopped off at the top end, and then above that, these numbers might get even more troubling when you look to a 65 to 80-year-old population, even though I know that's not one of the major things for NASH that the logistic regression showed. So with that, thanks to Samer, Stephen, Louise, and Naim. Excellent, I'll use the word again, sobering conversation, but I think really an important one, and people need to be more thoughtful about, more consistent about. Last go round, what's the one message you would like listeners to take away from this hour? And if there's a specific message that you would like either public health or the drug companies to take away, let's do that one also. Brave one, go first.
So really, it's a public health crisis that we're dealing with. We're beginning to see the effects of it on liver transplant utilization. Very quickly over the past decade or two, NAFLD jumped to the top of the list for utilizing liver transplantation. Right now, it's the second leading indication for transplant in the U.S. Very soon, it will take over hepatitis C as the leading cause for liver transplantation. The health costs of NAFLD are also on the rise, driven by increased increasing prevalence and of both NAFLD and NASH. So really, it needs a global effort, a national effort to do something that starts from prevention to screening and early identification of patients at risk, and in parallel to keep pushing hard on developing safe and effective therapeutics. Stephen?
Yeah, I completely agree with your comments. It's hard to add much to that. I just think what this shows is that we don't have a handle on this disease yet. We don't fully understand its epidemiology. We don't fully understand the natural history. We don't fully understand the pathogenesis. We don't have any FDA-approved treatment for it, but we know it's a big problem. Having said that, we're light years further down the path than we were when I started studying this disease back in the early 2000s. Light years further along. So we've come a long way. We're on the cusp of having our potential first FDA-approved treatment for the disease. We're developing better and better non-invasive tests that can not only diagnose the at-risk NASH population, but then can also potentially monitor therapeutic efficacy and even predict long-term outcomes. So I don't want to be the negative Nelly with this. I do think we've come a long, long way. It just highlights the fact that time is of the essence. We need to act quickly. We need to get drugs on the market for these people. We need to finalize some of these non-invasive tests that we're working so diligently on. And maybe more than ever, we need to double down on our disease awareness campaign for the public, as well as our primary care physicians, our endocrinologists, and our gastroenterologist and hepatologist colleagues. COVID's kind of gotten the limelight recently, and well-deserved. It needs a lot of attention. That's a global pandemic. It's the emergent crisis we're dealing with today. But I do think that in a way, COVID has also highlighted this very at-risk population of patients that we know do much poorer if they were infected with COVID. So let's don't lose sight of the fatty liver patients either while we're working through COVID. I think this patient population is even at greater risk because of the sedentary lifestyle that COVID forced us all to really kind of live with. So I'll end there.
I agree with the guys there. But the one thing I was thinking of when you were saying the average age of 65, Stephen and Samir's and Naim's study, the average age was 56. So I think unlike hepatitis C, where it's a baby boomer and the baby boomers get older, we are now seeing the NAFLD population and the NASH population has gone from the baby boomer population. It's now the baby boomer babies population. And the way we're rolling, it's going to be the baby boomers' grandchildren in the next 10 years. Now, we are not identifying this and stopping it quick enough to stop the younger generation dying before we do. So we will, sadly, see more and more of our grandchildren go before us unless we really wake up around the world and identify our risk populations. So not only will it be loss of life, it'll be cost. Putting yours and the figures that the guys have produced just together, that rolling backward age group really concerns me. It's quite frightening.
Totally agree. My last thought is that we've heard expressed a couple of times by people on this podcast who believe they reflect a regulatory point of view and frankly by the regulatory agencies, that because this is a slow progressing disease, that we need to pay even greater attention than we have historically to safety issues and not rush into treatment. If in fact the numbers that we're talking about today are accurate and they're produced more realistically than anything else we've seen, so therefore I expect they're accurate. Stephen's point is right. Coming out of this pandemic, we could have 1 in 10 Americans with F2 or F3 grade NASH. And at that point, A, you need to make sure it doesn't get to cirrhosis, which is what the agencies look at, but B, it affects a whole bunch of other health parameters. These numbers should kick up the urgency to think about treatments and approvals. And if they don't, then we're just refusing to listen. So with that, Samir, thank you for coming on board. Louise, Stephen, great everybody. Naim. So welcome back for our business portion. That was a fascinating, sobering, and I think a really important conversation. I hope you all got a lot out of it. I'd love to get feedback in the discussion groups or in any other way that you can about what you'd like us to cover more based on what you heard today. On the business front, just a couple of things. First of all, I want to thank everybody who listened to the NASH Congress episodes. We had lots of listeners, and what was interesting is a lot of you who came to those episodes might not have been here before. I say that because folks showed up and wound up downloading 5, 8, 15, even old episodes at a time. Let me invite you to stay current current. Send us your email to questions@surfingnash.com. We'll let you know every week what we're talking about. Or follow either Surfing NASH or Hepdynamics on LinkedIn, or come to the discussion groups on LinkedIn and Facebook. All those are places that you can stay in touch with what's going on here. Number 2, Digital ILC, the annual EASL meeting, will be at the end of June, and we will start discussing next week how we plan to cover that event. And we're going to have a lot of stuff going on. I'm very excited about it. Number 3, just miscellaneous. We hit 80 countries last week, Lithuania being number 80. Now, I would have thought Lithuania would have shown up earlier, but we haven't heard anything from Estonia or Latvia either. So Baltic countries, you've got some work to do. And finally, and as always, I want to thank our exceptional team, Mike Wilson, who will be challenged in some unique ways by this episode because of some what I heard is background noise he's going to have to work with. Eric Rounds, who's driving our social media further into even new directions, and Polly Lee, who makes sure all this stuff goes on time. Finally, obviously, you, our listeners, who make this worth doing and who keep swelling in numbers. So with that, let me say goodbye for now. Spring is coming in the U.S. Sites are opening up. I hope everybody is sure to stay careful and stay healthy. Enjoy our freedom, but use it. We are our increasing freedom. Use it wisely. Stay safe. Surf on. See you next week on the podcast. Bye-bye now.
Have any questions for the surfers? You can send them to questions@surfingnash.com, and we will answer on episode 26 in the LinkedIn and Facebook discussion groups or on the website. Listen again next week when Mazen Nuruddin joins the podcast to discuss escalating and de-escalating NASH therapy right here on Surfing the NASH Tsunami.